The box had been sitting under her bed for 3 years, and Maeve Colquhoun had told herself every single morning that she was not going to open it. She'd kept that promise longer than she'd kept most others lately. It was a shoebox, the kind that holds winter boots, wide and deep, and inside it were the things she couldn't bring herself to look at and couldn't bring herself to throw away. Her Canadian Forces Service Medal, her Sacrifice Medal, the Operational Service Medal with the bar that said Expedition, a folded letter from a colonel whose name she'd tried to forget but couldn't, a photograph of her and 3 other nurses standing in front of a Hercules transport plane somewhere she was no longer allowed to discuss, all of them squinting into the same flat desert sun, all of them grinning like they hadn't slept in 4 days, which they hadn't. She'd been 28 in that photograph. She looked about 45. Now she was 31, and she was standing in the kitchen of a 1-bedroom apartment in Sudbury, Ontario, eating crackers out of the box because she'd forgotten to buy bread, staring at the eviction notice that had arrived that morning. 14 days. Her landlord, a dry-voiced man named Terence, who communicated exclusively through official documents, had given her 14 days to either produce 2 months of overdue rent or vacate the premises. She did the math again, which she'd been doing obsessively since 7 a.m. Her bank account had $43 and some change. Her next employment insurance deposit wasn't coming for 11 days, and even then it wouldn't be enough. Her last shift at Horizon Regional had been 6 weeks ago, the night everything fell apart, and whatever appeal she'd filed through the union was sitting somewhere in a pile of paperwork that no one seemed to be in any hurry to process. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of being suspended without pay while the hospital completed its internal review, a phrase that had begun to feel like a kind of slow suffocation. She ate another cracker, stared at the notice, looked at the window, where a light January snow was coming down over the parking lot with complete indifference to her situation. Then she went and got the box from under her bed. The pawn shop was on Larch Street, wedged between a payday loan place and a phone repair kiosk that had been going out of business since approximately 2019. It was called Carver & Sons, though there was only one person visible inside. A heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular stillness of someone who'd heard every story and stopped being surprised by any of them. Maeve pushed through the door. A bell chimed. She set the shoebox on the glass counter. The man looked at it, then at her. "Help you? I have some medals," she said. "Military. Canadian Forces. I don't know what they're worth. I need to know what they're worth." He didn't reach for the box immediately. That was something she noticed. He just looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, exactly. More like the careful attention of someone deciding whether to say something. "You serve?" he asked. "Yes." "What branch?" "Canadian Army. I was a nursing officer." "2 deployments." He nodded slowly, then reached under the counter for a pair of cloth gloves. That was when she noticed the small framed photograph bolted to the shelf behind him. A younger version of himself in desert camouflage, shaking hands with someone in a suit, a Canadian flag in the background. He pulled the box toward him and lifted the lid. She'd told herself she wouldn't watch his face. She watched his face. He went through the medals carefully, one by one, holding each one up to the light. When he got to the Sacrifice Medal, the one she'd received in a private ceremony after the incident that ended her 2nd deployment, his hands went very still. "Captain?" he said quietly. "Lieutenant," she said, at the time. He set the medal down on the glass and looked at her with different eyes than before. "I can give you maybe $250 for the lot," he said. "That's fair market. Collectors pay more through private sale, but that takes time." $250. She'd known it wouldn't be enough. She'd known before she walked in. She didn't know why she'd come here except that she didn't know where else to go. She was about to say fine. She was going to say fine and take the $250 and figure out the rest later, the way she'd been figuring out everything later for 6 weeks. When the door opened behind her, the cold came in first, then the dog. He was enormous. A Belgian Malinois with a tactical vest still on, the kind she'd seen on working dogs in Kandahar, and he moved with that particular quality that well-trained dogs have, that absolute economy of motion, like every step was intentional. He came to stand beside her at the counter, and she had the disorienting sensation that he had not followed someone into the store but rather arrived, independently, with a destination in mind. Behind him came the man holding the leash. Though holding was generous, the dog was clearly deciding where to go, and the man was along for the record. He was somewhere in his 40s, she thought, with the kind of build that comes from years of physical work rather than a gym, wearing a canvas jacket with no insignia and the expression of someone who'd given up being surprised by his dog approximately 4 years ago. "Scout," he said. "Come on." Scout did not come on. Scout had placed both front paws on the glass counter beside the medals, lowered his head between them, and was staring at the sacrifice medal with what could only be described as recognition. The man with the leash looked at the medals, then at Maeve. "I'm sorry," he said. "He does this sometimes. I'll get him out of your way." "It's fine," she said, which it was, because somehow the dog's weight against her arm, he'd leaned into her without her noticing, was the first solid thing she'd felt all week. "Scout," the man said again. "Come." Scout turned his head and looked at his handler with the expression of an employee who has decided calmly and without apology not to follow instructions on this particular occasion. The man sighed. He looked at the medals again, and something shifted in his face. He wasn't looking at them the way a stranger looks at objects. He was looking at them the way you look at something you recognize. "Can I ask," he said to Maeve, "where you served?" She told him. Not the details. She hadn't told the details to anyone except the review board and her union rep and a therapist she'd seen twice before the cost became untenable. But the framework: Canadian Forces, nursing officer, Afghanistan, then a second deployment to a location she named only as Eastern Africa, the incident, the end. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual in her experience. Most people interrupted when they were thinking of what to say next. This man listened like listening was the thing he was actually doing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm Brecken," he said. "Corporal Aldrich Brecken, retired, JTF-2. She knew what JTF-2 was, Joint Task Force 2. Canada's Special Operations Unit, the kind of people who existed in the margins of military operations, the ones who were never quite where the official records said they were. Scout was my working dog," he said. "He retired with me 8 months ago. He doesn't usually." He looked at the dog, who still had not moved. "He doesn't usually do this." "Do what?" she said. "Refused to leave someone. She didn't sell the medals that day." She wasn't entirely sure why. Brecken had asked, carefully and without pressure, if she'd be willing to have a coffee nearby and tell him more about what had happened. Not the deployment, the now, the suspension, the review, and she'd said yes without fully deciding to. There was a Tim Hortons 2 blocks down. Scout walked between them on the sidewalk, which Brecken said was unusual. Normally the dog walked heel and sat beside Maeve's chair when they got a table, one paw resting on her boot. She told him about Horizon Regional, about the night in question, which had been a Thursday, a 14-hour shift in the surgical ward, an attending physician named Dr. Vance who had a pattern of signing off on medication orders without reading them, and a patient, 67 years old, post-op, wife waiting in the family room, who had nearly died because of a dosage error that Maeve had caught and refused to administer, and then reported through the formal channels, and then reported again, louder, when nothing happened. 3 days later, she'd been called into the nursing director's office. The review had been framed, by the time it was official, as a concern about her professional conduct and her combative interactions with surgical staff. The union rep had used the phrase expedited retaliation in an email which she'd printed and kept. The hospital's internal review had been ongoing for 6 weeks. She had been told to be patient. She had been told the process had integrity. She had been told, in one memorably awful phone call with HR, that these things took time. What no one had told her was what she was supposed to do about rent. Brecken listened to all of it. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and listened, and Scout stayed at her feet, and outside the January snow had graduated from light to determined. "Do you have the documentation?" he asked. "I have everything," she said. "I have the original incident report. I have the timestamps on the medication system. I have the emails. I have the patient's chart notes from before and after I flagged the order, and the attending physician, Dr. Vance," she said. "He's still working, full schedule. I checked." Something moved across Brecken's face, not surprise, but a kind of tired recognition, the look of someone who's seen a specific mechanism operate in different settings and is no longer startled by it. "You know what this is," he said. "I know what it is. It's not a review. It's a wait. Yes, They're waiting for you to run out of money, he said, and then they're waiting for you to run out of fight. And when that happens, they'll offer you something, maybe reinstatement with conditions, maybe a severance with an NDA, and you'll take it because you'll have no choice left. She looked at him across the table. How do you know that? Because I've seen it happen, he said. Not in hospitals, but the mechanism is the same. She wrapped her hands around her own cup and said nothing for a moment. Outside, a city bus went by, throwing up a gray spray from the curb. I can't afford a lawyer, she said. I know a few people, Brecken said. Not lawyers, but people who know how to make noise in the right places, people who know which journalists call back. She looked at him. Why would you do that? He looked at Scout, who had put his chin on Maeve's knee. He's never done that with a stranger, Brecken said quietly. Not once. The first call came from a woman named Darya, a journalist with the Sudbury Star who covered healthcare and had, as it turned out, been looking into Horizon Regional's surgical ward for unrelated reasons and found some of Maeve's reasons suddenly very related. Darya was brisk and methodical and had the particular quality of a person who genuinely enjoyed documentation. She asked good questions. She asked them twice, from different angles which Maeve respected. The story ran on a Thursday. It was not front page, it was below the fold, local section, but it included Maeve's name, her rank, her service record, a summary of the incident, and a response from Horizon Regional's communications office that said only that the hospital did not comment on ongoing internal reviews, which, as Darya pointed out in the piece, rather confirmed that one was ongoing. By Friday afternoon, Maeve's union rep had called 3 times. By Monday, there was a second article, this one noting that Dr. Vance had received 2 prior informal complaints in the past 4 years, neither of which had proceeded to formal review. By the following Thursday, exactly 8 weeks after her suspension began, she received a letter from Horizon Regional's legal office. She read it standing in the kitchen, still in her coat, having just come back from dropping off a form at the union office. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, not because her legs gave out, more because sitting on the floor seemed like the most honest response to what she was reading, and let the paper rest on her knee. The letter confirmed reinstatement, full back pay for the period of suspension. A formal acknowledgement that the original incident report had been filed appropriately and in accordance with nursing professional standards. A note that Dr. Vance would be subject to a separate review process that would be conducted by an external body rather than the hospital's internal committee. It did not include an apology. She'd expected that. Institutions rarely apologized in writing. But her name was in that letter, spelled correctly, followed by her credentials, and the word reinstated, and the phrase back pay, and for a long moment she sat on the kitchen floor and let herself feel it. The relief, which was enormous, and the anger, which was also enormous, and underneath both of them, something smaller and harder to name, something that was almost like the feeling of being seen. She called Brecken from the parking lot of a grocery store because she'd immediately gone out to buy actual food once she could think straight, and she'd been standing by her car holding a bag of groceries and her phone before she'd quite processed what she was doing. He picked up on the second ring. I got reinstated, she said. A pause. Back pay? Full? Vance? External review. Another pause, longer this time. Good, he said. It was such a small word. She found unexpectedly that it was exactly the right one. I want to come get the medals, she said. The ones I left at Carver & Sons. I left them there. I didn't sell them, but I left the box. I know, Brecken said. Old Carver called me. He's been holding them. She hadn't known that. She stood in the parking lot with her groceries, and the cold was sharp and clean, and for the first time in 8 weeks she wasn't calculating anything. She was just standing in the cold, in a parking lot, in January in northern Ontario, not calculating. He called you specifically, she said. He called me because of Scout, Brecken said. He said he'd never seen that dog do what he did. He wanted to know what it meant. What did you tell him? I told him Scout knows something about people that takes the rest of us longer to figure out. She thought about the dog's chin on her knee, the paw on her boot, the way he'd stood at the counter with his nose on the sacrifice medal like he was paying his respects. I'd like to bring Scout to come get them, she said. If that's okay. He'd like that, Brecken said. He's been unsettled all week. She went back on a Saturday morning, gray sky and the specific quality of cold that Sudbury does better than anywhere, not punishing, just honest, the kind of cold that doesn't pretend to be anything else. Old Carver, whose first name she learned was Stanley, had the box waiting on the counter with a cloth over it. He'd put a cloth over it. She didn't know why that detail struck her as much as it did, but it did. Scout went straight to the counter again. He didn't put his paws up this time. He just stood there, and his tail moved, not wagging exactly, more like acknowledgement. Stanley Carver looked at the dog, then at Maeve. "You know," he said in the slow way of someone who doesn't say things unless they mean to, "I've had people bring in all kinds of things. 40 years behind this counter. Wedding rings, instruments, tools their fathers left them." He looked at the box. "I've had a lot of medals, too, from a lot of different people. You can always tell the ones that came from someone who earned them and the ones that came from an estate sale." He tapped the side of the box once, lightly, with one finger. "These came from someone who earned them." Maeve picked up the box. It was heavier than she remembered, which made no physical sense, and she thought about that for a second before realizing the weight she was feeling was something other than mass. "Thank you," she said. "For holding them. I wasn't going to sell them," he said simply. "Didn't feel right." She looked at him. "You could've." "Could've," he agreed. "Didn't." Outside, the three of them stood on Larch Street, Maeve with the shoebox under her arm, Brecken with his hands in his jacket pockets, Scout sitting between them on the sidewalk, watching the street with professional attentiveness. "What happens now?" Brecken asked. "I go back to work in 2 weeks," she said. "They have to redo my scheduling, apparently. It takes time to slot someone back in." She paused. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the college, against Vance. The union rep thinks we have grounds." "You do?" Brecken said. "It'll take a long time. Most things worth doing take a long time." She adjusted the box under her arm. Scout looked up at her once, then looked back at the street. "I don't know what I would have done," she said. "If you hadn't come in that day, I was about to sell them. I was going to take the $250 and figure the rest out somehow, and I was going to." She stopped. Started again. "I was this close to just letting it go, the suspension, the review, all of it. Just taking whatever they offered me and signing whatever they put in front of me." Brecken was quiet for a moment. "You wouldn't have," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but Scout does." She looked at the dog, who was still watching the street, unconcerned with the conversation, apparently satisfied with how things had turned out. There was something in the file she'd never shown the journalist, never given to the union, never mentioned to anyone except her therapist, and then only in the most oblique terms. It was from her second deployment, the one that had ended in the incident, the one that had earned her the sacrifice medal in a private ceremony with no press and a colonel who wouldn't meet her eyes. It was a commendation for what she'd done in those final 48 hours. The decisions she'd made under conditions that the official language called extreme operational stress and that she called, privately, the worst 2 days of her life. She had been 29 years old and exhausted and frightened, and she had made the right calls anyway. She knew she had. It had taken 3 years and a dog in a pawn shop for her to feel like she was allowed to know that. She opened the box and looked at the sacrifice medal for the first time in 3 years. It caught the flat January light and held it. The commendation was still there underneath it, still folded the same way, still with her name on it. Lieutenant Maeve Colquhoun. For exceptional judgment and steadfast commitment to the welfare of those in her care, under conditions of grave personal risk. She read it once, folded it back up, put it in her coat pocket instead of back in the box. It was, she decided, time it stopped living under her bed. The snow had started again, that light, unhurried Sudbury snow that fell like it had nowhere particular to be. Scout stood up from his sit, shook himself once, and looked up at her with those amber eyes that had started all of this. She reached down and scratched behind his ear. He leaned into her hand, and she thought about the night she'd filed the incident report, the way her hands had been shaking when she typed it, the way she'd sent it anyway. She thought about $43 and crackers out of a box in 14 days. She thought about the word reinstated in a legal letter and the word good on the phone, and an old man in reading glasses who'd put a cloth over her box of medals because it didn't feel right not to. None of it had been easy. None of it had resolved the way she would have written it if she were writing it. There was still a process underway, still a physician who had not yet been held to any accounting, still a nursing director who had never apologized and probably never would. The system had not fixed itself. The system had required pushing. More than one kind of push, from more than one direction, and it had still taken 8 weeks and 2 newspaper articles and the very specific stubbornness of a retired military dog who'd decided, for reasons of his own, that she was worth staying for. But she was still here. That was the thing. She was still standing on this sidewalk on a Saturday in January with her medals in a box and her commendation in her pocket and her job waiting for her in 2 weeks. She was still here, and she was still a nurse, and she had not let them make her into someone who looked away. That had to count for something. She was starting, slowly and carefully, and with the particular stubbornness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of easy certainties, to believe that it did.